Anyone wants me to put on the headphone and the microphone, let me know, but I talk pretty loud when I want to. Anyway, I'm going to present this memories of my father, and I'm going to start with the map of the Western when he first was appointed president, and I'll come back to that later after I go back in history. But this is Western in 1955 from an aerial picture. My father, Western was broke. They had no money. They had 1,600 students, and they operated on paycheck to paycheck. And he had no money to build anything, so he paid an airplane to go up and take this picture. And this picture shows the president's home where I moved when I was 8 years old, up there. And that's the Kentucky building. And behind the Kentucky building on the left is the cabin where John Carpenter lived, so we were right across the street from each other. There was no University Drive. My father constructed University Drive in the 60s, which went all the way around. There were tennis courts. His first building was dormitories for men. You can see Russellville Road going up and down there in front of the president's home and on this side of the Kentucky building. You can see Jonesville, and most of Jonesville was gone by 1955. What was left were some 3 or 4 nice houses down by the underpass going under Russellville Road. Most of Jonesville was just old houses. This is the way it was when he first took over. Over on just this side of the tennis courts, where Downing Center is now, they had a big bonfire every year. Western, the maintenance crew, every time they had a desk or they had any scrap wood, they threw it in that field. And the bonfire that they finally lit the night before homecoming, they would light the bonfire, and all the students and the cheerleaders and the team would all be there. And it would maybe be 3 stories, 4 stories tall. And the baseball field was right there. The baseball diamond was right there. The tennis courts looked out over the Russellville Road, and you can see there's virtually nothing back there. So Jonesville was pretty much gone by the time we got to 1955. This is the summary of my father's career. When he was inducted into the Hall of Distinguished Alumni, and I'll have a lot to say about that toward the end of this talk. But you can see that while he was here, he built 43 major construction projects, 43 buildings, and most of them are still up there. And he was quite a planner and a plotter to make the construction work properly, and I'll get to that in a minute. He has Distinguished Citizen, Kentuckian of the Year, and he was the first person known as Mr. Western. Lee Robertson came along later, and he was Mr. Western, and now I'm waiting for another Mr. Western to come along. Anyway, my father grew up on a poor dirt farm in Marion County, Lebanon, Kentucky, out about 10 miles outside of town, in a huge family. And they went to a school near the farm for grade school. And when it came time to go to high school, they had no money. They were broke. They couldn't afford to feed him. And he moved into town and got a room, free room and board at the hotel downtown in return for being the bellboy, the jack of all trade. Starting his freshman year in high school, he worked at that hotel for 4 years and lived in that hotel for 4 years. That's him second from the left on the basketball team in 1926. This is him on the center. He was the fullback. He was an all-state fullback. And last night I went in his jewelry box, and there was a little gold football that says most valuable player for the Lebanon High School football team in that year. Well, when he graduated from high school, nobody had ever been to college in his family, and most people hadn't gone to college in the town. So he got a job. Some of the family, some of his older brothers and sisters had moved to Louisville. And he went to Louisville and was living with Aunt Lillian. And he got a job at the Courier-Journal as a cub reporter, working in the sports department for a famous sports writer named Earl Ruby, who was famous for decades and decades and decades. Coach Diddle came up to the Courier-Journal and recruited him and gave him an invitation to come to Western, expenses paid. He came down on the train and spent a weekend with Coach Diddle. And he shook his hand and said he'd come to Western and be on a scholarship. He came to Western, left the Courier-Journal, and about the third week of practice, he broke his back. So he couldn't play football, and he couldn't stay in school, and he was desperate, and he was leaving town, and he was out on the old bridge going over the Louisville Road, and Coach Diddle pulled up and picked him up and said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'm going home. I don't have any money." And Coach Diddle drove up to Bowling Green Bank, and my dad didn't know what he was doing, walked him in, took him to the president of the bank, and said, "I want you to loan this boy $25 and I'll co-sign." He drove up on top of the hill to where the goalpost was and got my father a job as a short order cook in that restaurant. And my dad said that for $2.50 you were fed breakfast, lunch, and supper at Potter Hall, and a box lunch on Sunday for a week for $2.50. So $25 went a long way back then. There he was on the football team briefly. Now, this was my grandfather. My grandfather was William Pierce. William Pierce graduated from Yale in 1912 and got a job as president of a college down in Abilene, Texas. They hired him at Ogden College, and he came to Bowling Green and was the president of Ogden College. In 1928, Ogden College and Western merged, and my grandfather got a job under Henry Hardin Cherry at Western College as the head of the Extension Service. The Extension Service, kids didn't come to school. Teachers had 12 hours of college and were teaching in high schools. So the Extension Service recruited students and went out into the area and tried to convince students to come to Western and tried to help teachers use correspondence schools to get their more hours on their teaching certificates. That was my mother's father, and he married the boss's daughter, I guess you'd say, because he met my mother and married her in 1931. My dad's first job in 1929, Henry Hardin Cherry gave it to him and gave him a car, and first time he had ever had a car, first time he'd ever driven a car. He said he was in heaven. Anyway, my grandfather worked at the Extension Service, and Henry Hardin Cherry hired him to work for my grandfather at the Extension Service. Here he was on the debate team. I saw an article in the Park City, where they went to U of L and beat the U of L Law School in a debate. They were a great debate team. Here he was up there in a theater production. And here he is working for the College Heights Herald in 1931. And I just found this myself when I looked. There's my mother and there's my father before they went out, in the middle of that page. So my mother said my dad was the handsomest man on campus. Now, this is the graduate club. There's my dad down in front. And if I go into the history of fraternities at Western, Henry Hardin Cherry didn't believe in fraternities. He believed they were elitist and they were exclusive, but he had a lot of clubs. They had the non-society club, whatever that means. And here's Henry Hardin Cherry. In 1931, he gave my dad that job. No, 1929. January 1st, 1929, my dad went to work at Western and had the car and got the rest of his tuition. He got his bachelor's degree and his master's degree at Western, and I think in 1936 he got the master's degree. My dad loved Henry Hardin Cherry. Henry Hardin Cherry was a brilliant man and built the school as it virtually existed in that first picture I showed you. This is Van Meter Auditorium back then, and this is Chapel. Chapel was a part of Western. Henry Hardin Cherry would get up and give great speeches every week at Chapel. My dad got up and gave great speeches every week at Chapel. Chapel was a way of life. Eventually, during my dad's presidency, there were too many students for Van Meter, so Chapel moved down to Diddle Arena in 1961. My dad went to war. He enlisted in the Navy in 1943. And he had already become very good friends with Dr. Garrett, the president. And he was also, in 1947, the head of the Kiwanis for the Kentucky-Tennessee District, the highest level that anybody from our local Kiwanis club ever made. This is Vets Village. This was Vets Village after World War I. In World War I, they got these surplus trailers from the Army, and the vets built a village, and I would have pointed it, I'll get to it when it's get the picture up again. But Vets Village is where I grew up until I was 5 years old. And Vets Village was right behind McLean Hall. Vets Village was kind of in the parking lot behind the dormitories. There used to be a street called Virginia Garrett Drive that went from Russellville Road to Normal Drive, and it's now been a pedestrian walkway between the dormitories on the south side of campus. I didn't stay in one of those trailers. They built some houses. The students built the houses, and they built them pretty good. They had asbestos siding, but they were two-bedroom houses. There were about 7 of them, and these were replaced eventually by those houses. And this is me as a baby. My big brother Hardin, who ended up being 6'4", is on the left. You can see he's bigger than the other boys. And they had been fishing, and that's our house behind us at Vets Village. When my dad went in the Navy in 1943, he sent this letter back to my mother. And at the end of the letter, you can see the people he really cared about, because he said, best of the best to the that'd be President Garrett, to the coach, Coach Diddle, Harvey, I don't know who that is. Agnes was Agnes Potter, and Harry Potter lived out on Nashville Road and were great friends. The Uhls were Oscar Uhl and his wife, who lived on Cedar Ridge. Mr. Pierce, who is his father-in-law, Mamaw, who is his mother-in-law, and the gang in the office. And he called himself the most inexperienced man in the Navy. He was very, very involved with the College Heights Herald and the Talisman. And because of his connections with the Courier-Journal, the College Heights Herald was elevated to a major publication equal to the Courier-Journal when he was in New York City and places. He would have press passes from the College Heights Herald issued him by Madison Square Garden and everywhere else that he wanted one. And you can see how big the College Heights Herald was, how many people worked on that newspaper. And it was an award-winning newspaper throughout its history. And he took care of the Talisman. He'd already gone off to the Navy when they produced this Talisman, but they dedicated the 43 Talisman to him. This was the house they built on Sumter Avenue for $5,000, and they had to sell it when he went in the Navy. Here he is as the advisor to President Paul Garrett. Paul Garrett's over on the left. This was probably in 47, 46, because President Garrett became very ill. Here is the first ever AP basketball poll in 1949, with Western Kentucky as third in the country. And my father promoted Ed Diddle. He promoted Ed Diddle everywhere. My mother told me a story, and my dad used to drink. He said, "Do you know why I named you Kelly and not your older brother?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Because I wasn't sure how I was going to turn out when your older brother was born. But by the time you were born, I was pretty convinced I was going to be leaving you a good name." And that's how he left it. But anyway, my mother told me a story starting in the 40s, and we had a basketball team that was really good. And if you look back at that letter in the Navy, he said he went to see Ned Irish to see Sonia Henney in the ice show, because Ned said it was a good one and gave him free tickets. Ned was the manager and ran Madison Square Garden. And my father was friends with him, close friends, and Madison Square Garden was where the National Invitational Tournament was, the NIT. And the NCAA just barely had been formed, and the NIT was the national championship. He went to New York, and he took our basketball team up there, and we got in second, I think in 42 or 43. And our team went off to war, and they came back and played, and they were mature, and they were even better. During that period of time, when we ended up third, we were always in the top 10 in the country because of the New York sports writers and my dad's promotion of Ed Diddle. I remember my dad told me one time, he came up with a story that got national publicity that Western Kentucky had the tallest team in the country. It was averaged 6 foot tall. And he took the averages and he compared them to every school. And my mother told me a story. My dad went out drinking with these sports writers from the New York Post and all of the New York papers, and that's where the seat of all publicity started, was in New York. And he went out and they got to drinking, and they came back to the hotel at 3 in the morning, and they woke up Diddle, and my mother and my father were in one room, and next door was Diddle, and she could hear him beating on his door. And they went in, and he brought in 4 sports writers that said, "Coach Diddle, I want you to show them how to cook a country ham." and they had never heard of one. And Diddle, he didn't drink, but he had that voice, and I can't imitate him. But he said those sports writers were drunk, and they just loved Coach Diddle. And he got a waistband and a wastebasket, and he turned it upside down, and he told them how to cook a country ham. And they all fell in love with Diddle, and there were stories all over every newspaper in New York the next day about Coach Diddle. My father was named Kentuckian of the Year, and so was Coach Diddle by the Kentucky Press Association. That's the old red barn back there. We called it the old red barn. There was really a barn before that. This was the Health and Physical Education building. This is where we had so much success. And you can see those people hanging their feet down on the rail up there. I would get to go to the game early. And my dad liked to carry me around like a mascot or a pet, you know. And so some of my first memories are going from Vets Village with my dad, him holding my hand, and we walking up the hill and going in to the physical education building. And I would go up and hang my legs off that rail and get a mid-court seat before they let anybody in. And so my dad would sit down at the sports table on the court, and he would type a story. This went on. I went to ball games from 2 years old till the gym closed, every ball game. And he would type a story about the game. And the second the game was over, he would type the score, and we would run out of the gym and get in the car and drive downtown to WKCT radio, where we would put the story on the wire, the AP wire. And he said, if we can get our score in the paper in New York City, it'll say Western Kentucky, and that's worth money. And he said, if they print the story, that's even better. But mainly he would always say, we beat the deadline. We beat the New York City deadline for getting in a newspaper. And the old football stadium was really fun. It's where the colonnade is now, on top of the hill. And it was cold back then, I remember that. It was a lot colder. We do have global warming or something. It's a lot warmer today than it was then. But anyway, it had a press box over, a wooden press box that was 2 stories tall. It held the maintenance equipment underneath and the bottom. And you went up these old stairs, and there was a long rail, and all the sports writers would sit up there and look over the football field. And we would go up there, and he would take me into the locker rooms. We would go. Nick Dennis was the coach. He was an Armenian. He had a Metropolitan automobile. He talked funny like Coach Diddle. And he was a little impish guy. And when I got to about 11 years old, they wanted to keep me out of trouble, so I'd go with Coach Dennis on a recruiting trip that would take about 4 weeks. And we would never stay in a motel or a hotel. We always stayed with one of his friends. I felt a little uncomfortable. I always ate in their house, and we would recruit football players. And I remember we went up to north of Covington, and the Burts lived on the Ohio River, looking down over the Ohio River in an old stagecoach house halfway between Cincinnati and Covington, halfway between Cincinnati and Louisville. And the Burts taught me how to water ski, and Jim and John Burt. Jim Burt came back and became a doctor. But Jim Burt went to the 1973 Tangerine Bowl. We went to the Refrigerator Bowl in Akron, Ohio with Jimmy Fikes, and it was a pretty good bowl. But the Tangerine Bowl later became the Citrus Bowl, and the Tangerine Bowl was in Orlando. We went down there and we beat Coast Guard, and Jim Burt starred as a tight end, and so Jim Burt got drafted. And the American Football League was battling the National Football League to see who could get the most talent. So they paid Jim Burt $50,000 cash to sign with the New York Jets. American League had just started a couple years before. So he flies to New York, and they take him out on the stage, and he's standing there with Joe Willie Namath as the #1 draft pick, and he's the #2 to catch Joe Willie's balls. And Jim came back home and thought about it and sent their $50,000 back to him and went to medical school and became a doctor here. So just an amazing man. Here's in 1949 on the way to the NIT, and that's President Garrett on there, my dad. That's Jimmy Gilbert, if you ever heard of Graves Gilbert. That's Jimmy Gilbert's the son. He was a very good golfer. That's Coach Diddle. And that's Ted Hornback behind my father. And that's Johnny Oldham up there on top. And that's Dr. Gilbert up on top. All right, the day he became president, they sent a photographer down to take our picture at our house on Chestnut Street. We were living in Vents Village, and my dad had looked at this house, but he couldn't afford it. They were holding an auction, and I think the auction went on for 2.5 hours because they came and got my father, and the banker said, I'll loan you the $12,000 to buy this house on Chestnut Street that's now a fraternity house. And they took our picture, and that's me at 7 years old, and I was already going to St. Joe grade school then. And it'd be a good time to talk about Jonesville, because my father was the first person to allow a black person to go to Western. He opened us up from segregation. Racism was terrible. I remember people calling people names just walking down the street. I mean, it was horrible. When Clem Haskins came and was in Diddle Arena, I remember people calling him names. They wouldn't let him in the country club, you know. So anyway, I remember I took the bus to St. Joe my first year, and then I talked my mother into letting me ride the bike in second grade, third grade from then on. But in the first grade, one day I didn't come back on the bus, and there was a black friend in my first grade class at St. Joe. It was integrated. And I talked him into walking home with me. And we went home and we played and we had a good time. And at 5:30 every afternoon, we ate supper. And I told him it was time for him to go home. I had to eat supper. And I took him out on Chestnut Street and I pointed him and said, you just go down that way and turn left. We started eating about 15 minutes after we were eating. The doorbell rang and I went to the door. And there was my friend, and he was bawling. His name was Butch. And he was just a ball, and he got lost. He couldn't find his way. And I was so embarrassed because I didn't tell my parents he was even there. And my mother and father came out, and they brought him in, and they fed him, and then we played in my room. And then we went down to his mother's house on Main Street and hung out there. And there were a bunch of kids in that place. We hung out there for maybe 20, 30 minutes. And on the way home, he told me all about the mother. Her husband had left her. She had like 9 kids. She was supporting them. She was a maid up on East Main and had the family take care of the kids. He didn't have a racial bone in his body. And so every now and then they've come out with a Jonestown documentary. And it kind of insinuates that he took over Jonesville. In 1954, in Congress, we had William Natcher had just gone to Congress, and he grabbed some urban renewal money from the federal government for Bowling Green. And they formed an urban renewal commission. And they cleaned out everything on the north side of St. Joe for all the way to the river. Just tore them down. They had to be 78% slum before they could do it. And Bailey Butler, who later sold cars in Bowling Green, he was the head of the Urban Renewal Commission as far as my memory goes. I could be dead wrong about that, but I think he was the head of it. And they condemned a lot of the Jonesville property. And after Urban Renewal took some, there were about those 3 or 4 houses in the Mount Zion Church were on down toward the underpass, and Western condemned those. And I read some of the letters, and they paid this lady $7,500 for a house, and I'll show you the house in a minute. And his letter said, and this is going to change your life, this money. Because you remember, he bought the house on Chestnut Street for $12,000. And John Minton used to live in a house that was lived in by the Gaines family before John. And this is the auction in 1953 where they sold that house that is now the College Heights Foundation on Chestnut Street. It sold for $33,000, that antebellum house. And so the Chestnut Street was $12,000 and she got $7,500. So anybody that wants to say my dad screwed them is lying, because they weren't. They got big money. My dad bought this lot. They cut off the back of the property on Normal Drive and sold 3 lots. My dad bought that lot, and after Paul Garrett died, he helped Virginia Garrett build a house there where she lived till she died on that lot. This is the house that went for $7,500, and this is in 1955. And as I said, there was a lot of racial tension. And when my dad recruited Clem Haskins and Dwight Smith, they were the first blacks to ever play basketball in a Kentucky school. They were groundbreakers. But they had a cross burned in front of the president's home, and they had a cross burned in front of a black funeral director in 1953 in Bowling Green, Kentucky. So here's Diddle Arena, and you can see State Hall is back there with the steel in the background. That's the maintenance department, which is now on top. My dad built the parking structure on top of the maintenance department because it was so ugly. But it's still there. The maintenance department's still under that parking structure. And the heating plant was right over on the other side. You can see the smokestack sticking up over the top of the maintenance department. Now, to build Diddle Arena, we went on a vacation from Bowling Green to Los Angeles to San Francisco and back, driving. It took 2 or 3 weeks. And my dad, it was like choreography. Every day we stopped at a gymnasium. We went to Iowa City to the brand new gym. My dad wanted to have an ice rink, like Boston, ice under the floor. And everywhere he went, they said, don't do ice. It's terrible. Hard, maintain. It sweats on the floor while you're playing basketball. My mother would sit in the car, and we would go into a university, and wham, bam, we'd go up to the president's office. He'd shake her hands, and he would have the maintenance people, the head of food services, all of the people that worked in the bottom of the gym, not the president. He didn't want to see those people. We would walk around those gyms, and he would ask them questions about how does this work? How does this work? What problems you're having with this? We went to the Forum in Los Angeles, same thing. Every one of them, he had them planned out. We went in, got it done in less than an hour while my mother sat in the car, and we stopped at 10, 12 gyms. And he started a process right there. Of course, none of them had the roof that Diddle Arena has. He had read about that. He wanted it to be like Freedom Hall, without a post in between any person sitting in the gym holding up the roof, which most gyms back there couldn't span that much space. And they would say, what are you doing here? He says, I'm going to build a gym in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and it's going to hold 13,500 people. And they said, oh, you're crazy. It'll never get that crowd, and you'll never hold that number of people. And so he built Diddle Arena, and that roof is still a good roof today. It's an erector set with a circle of steel and all these pieces of steel pushing, and the footers were 6 feet by 6 feet with steel all the way up, and they went down about 20 feet to base rock. Just a marvelous piece of architecture for that time. This was my father's father. He gave up on the farm and got a job at the Lebanon Police Department, and then he transferred to the Louisville, Jefferson County Police Department. There he is on the Louisville Police Department, and there's been a lot of Thompsons work at the Louisville Police Department. My cousin, Captain Steve Thompson, his son is the chief of police in Bardstown now, and had worked as a lieutenant in the Louisville Police Department. That's me and my dad in front of our house in Vets Village. That's my mother and dad over on the right, about 1965, in the garden over by the president's home. Virginia Garrett had lots of flowers. She built gardens. She had a waterfall back there back then there were a lot of sunken pools with fish in the neighborhoods in Bowling Green. I remember they were liability. Once insurance came in, they had to fill them all in and Stop them. That's my brother Hardin at some kind of dance. That's us as the most serious people you've ever seen up in the left. I don't know why we were so happy. Not a smile on the face. So anyway, I'm going to St. Joe, going home on my bicycle, going back home, and I had to be home at 5:30. School was out at 3. So I went to pool halls, went all over town, went everywhere. And there were kids that wanted to beat me up because I lived in that big house up on the campus and my dad was the president. They didn't understand that starting in about 1959, my brother got a brain tumor and he had 5 more after that. And he spent probably half of his time in the Vanderbilt hospital. My dad was bankrupt from paying the medical bills. We were living in a very unhappy house. That big house was heated from the heating plant and made noise, clank, 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 all night long. We had a couple of window air conditioners, and that was it. It wasn't a happy home, and everybody thought it was happy and wanted to kill me. Anyway, that's my mother and father. When they came back from their honeymoon, they went on a steamship from Bowling Green out to the Mississippi and back for their honeymoon. That's me with my dad in the backyard, and that's me right there as a freshman in high school. Now I see a guy named Dick Green. This is a funny story. There's a boy named David Line and John Line, but David Line and Dick Green were in the same class, and President Kennedy got shot. And almost everybody here is old enough to know where you were when President Kennedy got shot. Well, I was a freshman in high school, but I was taking a class down in a biology department at Kelly Thompson Hall. And they said we had to go back up to the school, and we went up there and the public address system came on and told us to go home. They were closing school that day. So Dave Line and Dick Green are walking home. They live down on Cedar Ridge. And Dave looked at Dick and said, "I can't believe somebody shot President Thompson." and Dick said, "Yeah, he was a good guy." And when they got home, they told their parents that somebody had shot my father. Anyway, this is later. Georgia Bates was his lifelong secretary over there. She started working for him when he was assistant to the president. Georgia was working in the cafeteria, but she was good with numbers and she knew shorthand. And he hired her as his secretary. And so back when I was the mascot, we went on a circuit every day. The circuit was, we'd go to the Helm Hotel barbershop and get the gossip, and they would give him a little haircut every day. I couldn't believe it. Everybody was in there. You got to learn everything in town. Then we would go to Pete's Dixie Cafe. Then we would go over to Houston Griffin's Laundry. Then we'd go to Harry Leachman Motor Company. Then we'd go out to see L.T. Smith at his place out on Nashville Road, which wasn't far out Nashville Road. We'd go to the Bob Cochran's house on Nashville Road across the street. We went on a circuit of visiting people every day. He would meet Georgia Bates at 5:30 in the morning and give her dictation for the day. And then we'd go on that circuit, and then he'd go back to his office. And his motto was, "My door is always open." And it was up in the administration building in front of Van Meter Hall. And if you went up to Van Meter, you'd take a left, and he had the office down there. And she was out there, and there was a church bench. And any student that wants to see him came up and got on the bench and slid down. And all during the day, he talked to people. And if I wanted to see him, I got up and went up and got on the bench and slid down and went in. And he came home in 1956 and said, "There's a new invention. It's called a golf umbrella. I want it for Christmas." And my mother found it in the Sears catalog and bought him a golf umbrella. And he said, "Thank you." And we didn't know what he wanted to do with it. Well, he kept it in his office. And if it ever started raining, he quit seeing people. He'd grab that golf umbrella and he'd go out on campus. And he'd see a student that didn't have an umbrella, and he'd say, "Get under my umbrella." And he'd come home that night and say, "Today it rained, and I met so-and-so from Campbellsville. And her mother and father, I know her father, and she's going to major in this." And he would tell us their whole life story. And he said, "You'll never find a better place to meet somebody than in the rain under an umbrella." My father came home one day and he said, "I've got great news. The State Department is giving us a trip around the world as an ambassador." Really, I think he was doing a little spying, but that's just my suspicion, because he sure did go to some funny places. But he said, "It took me a long time, but I talked them into letting you go with us." Now, I'm 13 years old, and last place I want to be is in a hotel room with my parents for 2 months when I've got a girlfriend. So I threw a tantrum, and I stayed, and they went around the world. And that's her in the Philippines, my mother and father. All right. I don't know if it's north and south, east and west, but those are the 2 dorms closest to the campus down on Normal. And the college was broke. We had no money. The legislature didn't know what funding a building program was at that time. And so Eastern Airlines had a promotion that children flew free. And so my dad went to New York City on 2 occasions with me as a little boy. I was 7 and 8 years old. And we went up there, and he arranged to mortgage the campus. And he borrowed money with bond issues. And a guy named Harold Hume from Glasgow, if you've heard of the Rhodes Hume speaker series, Harold Hume was the president of Chemical Bank. And we went and visited Harold, and I sat in the corner like a fly. And then we went over and saw Julian Goodman. He was the second in command at NBC Television and became the president of NBC Television. Chemical Bank merged with Chase Bank, and Harold Hume became the president of Chase Manhattan Bank, which is a big deal. But Harold helped him navigate the bond issues, helped him introduce them people, gave them credit, gave them vouchers, and he floated the bond issue to build those 2 dorms. Those are his first 2 dorms. And he told me, as soon as I pay off a third of a dorm, I can build another one. And he was very, very astute with bonds, and he was very cautious about our credit rating and our bond rating. And we had the most excellent bond rating you could have. Every payment was made on time. And that's the football stadium up at the top. And Vets Village is right there. See that little cluster of houses? They're still there. There wasn't many. That was Vets Village, what was left of it. And I used to go play in Jonesville all the time. Back then, 5 years old, 6 years old, as long as you knew to look both ways before you went across the street, it was okay to go out. There's only been one stranger kidnapping in the history of Bowling Green. That's Morgan Violet. But back then, it was not even thought about. Nobody even considered not letting your child run around. Today, they'd be calling social services on you. So he formed the Student Advisory Council when he became president. That's my sister, Patty. Patty moved to Florida. Well, Patty got married in Washington, D.C. My dad told me, my son likes hamburger better than steak. He was planting that on me, so I would never order a steak. But she married a guy who had a PhD and became the dean of students at Central Florida University. And there's my dad in Georgia. And Georgia and my mother, they would joke. Georgia was his office wife. My mother was his housewife. And when he retired at Western, he built him a house down at the end of Park Street. And it was a duplex. And Georgia lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, and he and my mother lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. And then she had a stroke and died. She went to church every Sunday at Alvaton Church. And we had a blizzard pop up, and it stressed her out so much she had a stroke. Now, This is the Mammoth Cave KEA Leadership Conference. They had those from the time I was a little boy. We'd go to Mammoth Cave and have a picnic, and they would invite all of the superintendents from around, and the Kentucky Education Leadership Conference. And they would all come over, and we would be at Mammoth Cave at a big picnic. And the cafeteria would bring the food up, and food services. And so it got too big for Mammoth Cave, and they put it behind the Kentucky building for several years. And there's Coach Diddle. Yeah, there's Margie Helm. She was related to Harold Helm, I think daughter or sister, I can't remember. And John B. Rhodes, he was our judge here in town for years.
Best fun we ever had. Until you.
My dad decided to resign in 1969, and didn't tell us, didn't tell my mother, he might have told her, he didn't tell me. In fact, I told him, I understand why you're resigning. He said, why? And I said, because you have a complex. Talking about the Thompson complex that they had built for him. But he said he just wore out. And they held an appreciation day for him, and he got a golf cart. And he kind of got to pick who was going to be the next president. And he told me, he said, it's between Raymond Cravens and Dero Downing. He said, Raymond Cravens is better with academics, but Dero knows how to get the money out of Frankfurt. And that's how he ended up picking Dero. That's the Thompson complex that they built. There's the College Heights Foundation. My dad told me that the College Heights Foundation had been there from day one, but that any time anybody gave them the money, they just gave it out to the students as student aid. And when my dad took over the College Heights Foundation, it had $5,000 in the bank. And when he left, I think they had $50 million that he had raised while he was the head of the College Heights Foundation. And he was the first one to have a charity golf tournament. He got Bowling Green Country Club to give us a Monday, and we had a golf tournament and raised $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. He was big on the corpus. Building the corpus, and then taking the interest from the corpus to fund the scholarships. All right, in 1993, several things happened. Tom Meredith was going to cancel the football program. And Jack Harbaugh and I went down to eat at the Parakeet restaurant, and I hadn't heard about it. He told me that they were going to take it to the Board of Regents and cancel the football program. And I said, I think I can help. And so we went up to the red-white game, and Jack took me back into the locker room. We'd all prearranged it. And I told Jack when I got in there I wanted him to leave. I said, you've got to leave. And he said, I don't want to leave. And he finally left. And so I got him to hire me to represent him in a class action. Tom Meredith had been the president of the state school system, state colleges in Mississippi, and he had a pending racial discrimination class action case against him in Mississippi. Now, if he canceled the football program, he was going to cancel 67% of all black male scholarships at Western. And so they hired me, and I drew up a lawsuit in federal court and held a news conference and said I was going to file the lawsuit on Tuesday. If they canceled the program on Tuesday morning, I was going to file it against Western and Tom Meredith on Tuesday afternoon. And I want all former football players to come to the federal courthouse where we're going to hold a news conference and file this lawsuit. Well, I got a phone call. My secretary said, Doc Severinson's on the phone. And I said, Doc Severinson? What's he calling me for? And sure enough, it was Doc Severinson. And Doc said, Kelly, I want to come to Bowling Green and be at your news conference to support Western's football team. And I said, I'll pay my ticket if you can get somebody to pick me up in Nashville. I said, that's great. So anyway, we had about a 5 or 10 minute, very pleasant conversation. And I finally said, well, Doc, let me ask you a question. Why do you care so much about Western's football team? He said, I don't care about the football team. I care about the marching band. They'll cancel the marching band if they cancel the football team. He said, I was in the marching band at the University of Tennessee. And so Anyway, Western blinked and they cut the football program from $800,000 to $400,000, and they didn't cancel it. But I was out playing golf at Indian Hills, and Gene Burke came out and interviewed me and said, "You're going to file this lawsuit?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "There's a lot of really good people that graduated from Western that were on the football team. Just because you play football doesn't mean you can't go back and you have the discipline to be a leader in your community. And these pseudo intellectuals think that they're smarter because these other people have discipline and learn to come to practice on time." And so I get home and my dad says, "Kelly, I'm real proud of you for standing up for the football team, but did you have to call Tom Meredith a pseudo-intellectual?" When my dad first became president, they were broke. So he built the colonnade. It didn't take much money. He built it with the maintenance department and scraping money from here and there. And he built that colonnade because he wanted to build something. Before he built the 2 dorms, he built the colonnade. When my dad first became president, we lived on Chestnut Street, and he'd built a house out back for my grandfather, his father-in-law. And he lived out there. And he was in his 80s. He died when he was 94. But he was in his 80s then. And my dad said to me, he said, "You know, I'm president of Western, but all of the teachers at Western are in their 80s, and there's all a whiskey bottle in every drawer." So he found a statute that said it was illegal to have alcohol on a campus, on a state property. And he pumped that out and said, "Anybody caught with alcohol on state property?" And then he did a mandatory retirement age. Well, my grandfather was still working at the extension service at Western in his 80s, and he got mandatorily retired. And every Sunday we went to Catholic church. My mother and her family were Presbyterians, and they converted to Catholicism when she married my dad. So we went to Catholic church. And then we'd go home, and my granddad would make something called Welsh rabbit, which was scrambled eggs somehow. I don't know how it was. It wasn't very good. But anyway, it was some chilly days when my grandfather got mandatorily retired, and we're sitting at the kitchen table. All right. So in 1993, Tom Meredith decided he would form the Hall of Distinguished Alumni. And they put out the first, they formed a committee to name the first people that were going to be in the Hall of Distinguished Alumni. Well, my dad didn't even apply. He said, "Well, I'm Mr. Western. I built 42 buildings. I think probably I'll be considered." So they came out, and they had Cherry and they had Diddle, but they didn't have my dad. So I went up to visit him. I visited him about 2 or 3 times a week. And it was pretty sad. And my mother was madder than a hornet because he wasn't selected. And my dad was just kind of crushed. He didn't say anything. So I went to see Tom Meredith, and I said, "Tom, you'd better watch out. My mother is on a warpath, and she is stirring up some stuff." And because my dad should have been in that first Hall of Alumni. And so my mother was stirring up a little stuff, but I embellished it some. And so I was driving back from Park Mammoth, and I had my first bag phone, cell phone, and I was playing golf. And I'm coming home, and Tom Meredith calls me. He says, "Kelly, I got your dad into the first class. One of the guys that was picked has agreed to go next year, and tell your mother to be quiet." And I'm so happy I did, because this is his last speech. 1 month later, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he was dead 6 months later after this speech. And so this, probably the best thing I ever did was get Tom Meredith to do this.
I came, I practiced, I got hurt, I became useless to him as our football coach at that time, and eventually had to cease football entirely. He never wavered. He was as interested in me the day after I turned in my gear as he was the first day that I had it checked out to me. He told me that he would see what he could do to help me, but he would have to assign the job to somebody else at the end of the semester, which was rapidly approaching. Getting off into details, I don't want to do that. Let me back up and just say that the day came when I found myself in serious distress. And how he knew about it, I to this day don't know why. He did, though, and he found me, as he said, in that shot that we saw of him discussing that. And he took me down to the Bowling Green Bank and Trust Company and walked in, and I didn't even know what we were doing. It took me to Mr. Cuthbertson, who was the chief CEO of the bank, and said, "Mr. Cuthbertson, I have a boy here, and I want you to give him $25. And I'll sign his note." $25 doesn't sound like much money, but over in Potter, and some of you, very few of you, know that 21 meals a week, 20 hot meals and a box lunch on Sunday night was yours for $2.50. That's the relative situation of the time. And that $25 got me over a hump, which makes it possible for me to speak to you on this occasion. And out of that association, I had nothing to offer Ed Diddle. If I could have made the number one team of the fullback of the football team as fullback, I might have been repaying something, because that was the way it operated. But I was out of football, and he had nothing to gain by being kind to me or taking a special interest in me. But he stayed with me from then on, and he and I were close, very close friends until the day he died. Then I want to tell you about this great founder just for a minute, H.H. Cherry, whose grandson so eloquently paid tribute to him tonight. H.H. Cherry employed me, and I went to work June the 1st, 1929. When I left the Van Meter Auditorium to walk out to the driveway where a Model A Ford belonging to Western had been assigned to me, an automobile, to travel over Western Kentucky and to interview students and to see what they needed in the way of help, and to take the letters with me that they had written to H.H. Cherry and work out the problems they had, and go to teachers' meetings on Saturday when it was, and to talk to some teachers who were there on 16-hour certificates and 32-hour certificates about doing some correspondence work and signing them up there in correspondence, those who wanted to advance. Heaven. It started out as heaven. When I walked to that automobile from up on top under the facade, I to this day don't know for sure that my feet ever touched the ground. And I took off in that automobile to heaven. And I've been in heaven ever since. And tonight, I not only want to thank those who have engineered this event, I want to thank this institution. I want to thank everybody that has done anything whatsoever to help this institution during these 63 years that I have known it very intimately. I am grateful for every day that I have spent on this hill. There is no way for me to describe how lucky I think I have been just to have had the opportunity to live here and be a part of it and to feel it breathe and to see it progress and to see it win its battles and to know that with the strength that has been manifested here on this occasion tonight, that it is symbolic of what's going to happen tomorrow and the next month and the next year and throughout the future. Western is going to move forward as it always has. It's going to whip any problem that is confronted with because it's got the sinew and the spirit that will make it move in that direction at any time that it's called into a crisis. I want to say thank you to each of you for being here tonight. I want to say thank you to all of the people who have been a part of this. H.H. Cherry gave me a job and then gave me his friendship. I really don't know why I would ever be so lucky as to have the friendship of E.A. Diddle and H.H. Cherry. Two of the most dynamic, two of the most capable, two of the most compassionate, and two of the most dedicated men I have ever known in my lifetime. I could stand here all night and say thank you and call names. All I want to do is through you say thank you to the thousands, yes, thousands and thousands of individuals who have contributed to Western in the past 63 years. Say to this great institution, I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Billy, your dad made Western.
Thank you, Bill.
Could you tell us what his relationship with Jack Sagerville was?
Jack Sagerville.
Jack Sagerville.
When they went to Europe, when they went around the world, they left me with Jack Sagerville. He was my chaperone down at Central Hall. And I'd sneak out of there and sneak out their car out of maintenance. And Jack Sagerville and Bobby Houck and Owen Lawson would sit out there and try to catch me. But Jack Sagerville was a great guy.